Someone Else's Sunshine. Part 1. Pride. All I did was to express my opinion. It was an opinion which wasn't shared by the rest of the kids in the gang. There were intakes of breath. I can't even remember what the opinion was, but it was as if the gang had been waiting for an excuse to act upon an uneasy tension which I had begun to sense between them and myself for some time. I wasn't even allowed a chance to take my words back. It was too late, I was told. And that was when the bullying began. There was something calculated about it. I'd never shied away from expressing my own opinion, and a good deal of the suffering I went through took the form of indignation. How can people treat me this way? How dare they? I had always possessed an ego. My father never tired of telling me, "You know your trouble. It's this," and he'd point to his head, "and this," and he'd point to his mouth. But even my pride soon gave way to restless uncertainty. And of course, pride also had a lot to do with my keeping the bullying issue to myself. My parents more than once asked me whether or not there was anything wrong, anything I wanted to talk about. They could surely tell something was bothering me. They also knew that I had an obstinacy that would embarrass mules. And the more I kept it to myself, the more this restless uncertainty became obsessive speculation, which led nowhere. It wore me down. I found myself unable to concentrate on anything. I became distracted during conversations with others, and it was only when I happened to chance upon my tormentors at school, whether it was by chance or by design on their part, the knot in my stomach left me in no doubt. I was afraid of them. If I didn't worry myself to sleep, I worried myself into staying awake, rising each morning with the familiar knot in my stomach, no matter how generously the sun shone. For me, it was someone else's sunshine. As if going to school wasn't enough to dog me with weariness, the place that I began to dread most of all was the teacherless classroom. I would pray that teachers wouldn't arrive late to class, that they wouldn't leave the room. If they did, even momentarily, the intimidation would always begin with missiles of stationery aimed at the back of my head. This would be followed by taunts and threats, my surname called out in primeval grunts. Then would come the walking past my desk and accidentally shoulder barging into me from behind. It wasn't uncommon for me to discover at the end of a lesson the contents of my satchel strewn across the classroom floor, and on one occasion tipped out of the window. Another situation would involve being surrounded by 5 or 6 of these people I had apparently chosen to be different from, asking me which of them I felt I could beat in a fight. Of course, my answer would be my fate. If I said no one, they would say, "Yeah, but just suppose, if you could, who would it be?" If I again said no one, they would offer to choose for me. They would let me know when they had made their decision. There was a spinney across the road from our school where no teachers ever ventured. That was where the real fights took place. The fights that didn't get stopped until blood was drawn, or until the loser pleaded for submission. I lived in fear of being in a fight I didn't want to have, simply being forced to engage because there was no available alternative against a pugilistic aggressor before a baying crowd. I saw one older boy being kicked unconscious there, and I developed a nauseous dread of the place. That my fight should be arranged to take place there was unthinkable. But it was possible. After 3 weeks of this calculated persecution, I was frightened of sudden confrontation, and this wearisome period of waiting cast a shadow over pretty much every joy. With this kind of nagging threat hanging over my seemingly interminable days at school, I gave myself little cause to look forward to anything. I started to believe that I had the appearance of someone who looked like a pushover, someone who was just asking to be bullied. I was small, with an innocent and preoccupied expression. As I am an only child, I was always contented with my own company, but I began to resent the fact that I had no one to play football with anymore, no one to laugh and joke with. But then, what was there to laugh and joke about? My social life was very much reduced. Indeed, I could count my friends on one hand with fingers to spare, but I managed 2 visits a week to the local boys' club. For some reason, the bullies seldom showed up there, but that didn't stop me worrying that someday they might, and I managed also a Friday night trip to the pictures, hoping that I wouldn't, by some horrific accident, bump into them at the ticket booth. I made sure I sat at the back of the cinema, huddled down into my seat, with the hood of my parka coat over my head. But during those painful weeks, a new boy came to our class. Timothy Wicks. He seemed quite shy, but that could have been simply because he was new. I only spoke to him once. We discovered both our fathers had been in the armed forces, and that we'd both gone to the same infant school in Lincolnshire. He'd been fond of Lincolnshire because of the wildlife. He collected the Observer nature books, he said. I had no real interest in nature, so we never really spoke again. Meanwhile, my aggressors had decided, as I couldn't seem to decide for myself, that the person I might possibly be able to beat in a fight would be a boy called Harry Olive. The bullies called at our family home and asked my parents with pert cordiality if I was coming out. Of course, my parents, being none the wiser, called out to me that I had visitors. I'd pretty much guessed who it was at the door and realized that with bullies on our very threshold, I would have to face up to this haunting thing, away from my parents and our family doorstep. I knew that if I cowered and stayed at home, the blatant proximity of this threat would only increase the anxiety I was privately causing myself. When I left the house, closing the front door firmly behind me and with a seriously fluttering stomach, I heard one of the 6 bullies mumble almost in astonishment, "Hell, he's coming. He's turned up." The tone of his voice summed up my action perfectly. I was either brave or stupid. Probably both. It wasn't bravery that made me leave our house to do their bidding. It was desperation. I was ready to plead with them, which would, of course, have meant that I'd done their bullying for them. I was desperate to put an end to the whole thing. If pleading wouldn't help me, I'd simply have to fight.